Okay, I want to thank you, Brian, for joining us today for our Michigan Notable Book Author Conversation program. And I want to thank all the listeners out there who are going to tune in at some point to the YouTube video and watch this conversation. And I just want to let all the listeners know that the conversation is being recorded and it will be made available in about 1 to 2 weeks on the Library of Michigan website. We have to send it out to get closed captioned and some brief editing done, and then we will post it along with the other author conversations that we have recorded. So I want to welcome today author Brian Solomon. So welcome, sir. And go ahead and give us some background about yourself and how did you become a writer?
Sure. Well, I've been a writer really now coming on to more than 25 years, 26 years. I initially started in the late 90s professionally working
Okay.
for a reference book publisher.
Oh,
And and doing like biographical
mm,
encyclopedia
mm,
articles and things like that. And
mm,
not knowing really what I wanted my specialty to be in. But
mm.
I've been getting paid to write since 1997, so I must be doing
Excellent.
something right.
Oh, good, good, good. Are you at least having a fun time with all your writing adventures so far?
I love it now because I found the secret, which is stick to writing writing about what you love. Because I also spent years writing as a freelancer. You sometimes have to do things that are not your passion. I was
Mm,
involved in marketing, writing
mm,
marketing copy and being a copywriter and all that kind of stuff. And, being in a cubicle and having to
mm.
crank out copy on command is not
Oh,
ideal. I prefer, you know, I've always been that way since I was in school.
mm,
I've never been the kid who can apply himself
yeah.
the stuff that he hates to do. Like,
Mm,
math almost destroyed me in school because I could not apply myself because I just found it so boring and hated it. But these days I focus on the writing that I love and that I enjoy, and it's been fantastic. And the book that won the
mm,
award, Blood and
mm,
Fire, is
yeah.
really the book that I'm now, and really the piece of writing that I've done that I'm the most proud of.
Oh, good. So in talking about your writing process, what is your writing process?
Well, it depends what I'm writing about. So,
Mm,
if we focus on the book, say specifically,
mm,
I have a very kind of loose process where, like I
mm,
said before, I'm at my best
mm.
when, well, two things. I'm at my best when I'm under a little bit of pressure for deadlines and
Yeah,
things, and then I really
like,
kick into gear.
good.
But I'm also at my best when I can at the same time make my own schedule. Like, sometimes people will see
Mm,
me work and they'll go, my wife specifically will
mm,
go, how are you working right now? You're walking around the house. What is that? And I go, well,
mm.
that's part of my process. I I
Okay,
I
good.
like to perambulate. I
Mm,
move around.
mm,
I toss thoughts around in my
mm,
head. I have I've established a way of, especially when you're writing a biography, of having all the details sort of start to accumulate in your
mm.
brain over the
Yeah.
period of months of research, and it starts to form a coherent story. You need to have a narrative arc, especially
Mm,
if writing a biography. You don't want
yeah.
to write one of those biographies where it's just a list of things that happened. I mean,
Mm,
I've read biographies like that. They're boring, even if
yes.
they're about people that I'm interested in. And it's very
Mm,
disappointing when that happens. So, like right now I'm working on my next biography, which is also of a wrestler, Gorilla Monsoon. And
mm,
it's been this process of slowly, gradually doing interviews, looking up materials, reading
mm.
articles, and it just starts to kind of congeal in my head the story that I
Yeah.
want to tell, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. So for this particular book, Blood and Fire, how did you get this idea? I mean, were you just walking around thinking about one of your previous books or articles you were writing, and all of a sudden you got this idea? But so where did you get this
Well,
idea?
the book is a biography of a wrestler called the Sheik, the
Mm,
original Sheik, not the Iron Sheik.
geez.
And
Mhm,
I had been fascinated by him since I was a kid, even though he was sort of past his time by then.
mhm,
He was this interesting historical figure. He was still semi-active then.
Mm,
And you'd see him mentioned in wrestling magazines and things, and older fans would talk about him.
yeah.
And he just really stood out to me because he was so different from the kind of wrestling I was seeing on TV at the time, which was that Hulk Hogan, very polished
Yes.
cartoon era of wrestling. And so years later, when I started writing about wrestling, it always started, it started to kind of, everything would come back to him over and over again. No matter
Mm,
what I was writing about, it would intersect with the Sheik somehow. Like the book before that, at least the last wrestling book I did before that was called
mm,
Pro Wrestling FAQ. And
mm,
it was a more of a reference book.
yeah.
And had these little bios of famous wrestlers. And the one I did on the Sheik, again, it started opening up my mind, just going, how is there not a book about this guy already? I mean, he passed in 2003.
Mm,
Heyday was really the 60s and 70s. I mean, there's been plenty of time. This
yeah.
needs to happen, and I started thinking, I want my next book to be a biography because
Mm,
wrestler, in a lot of fields, but I think wrestling's like this too, but people love personality driven books.
mm,
So I had done the reference type of book and I wanted to do a biography. And when it came time to think about who to do it on, that
mm.
was a no brainer for me. It was sort of
Oh,
like the idea I had in the back of my head. This is the guy that needs to have a book done. And,
man.
and thankfully, when I pitched it to ECW Press, they
Yeah.
agreed with.
Well, could you just speak a little bit more? I mean, how long did it take for you from like research to actually publishing this book? How long of time?
I was
Okay.
fortunate to have a lot of time on my hands
Mm,
because most of the process of the book was
mm,
during the height of COVID.
okay.
And so I did not have kind of a 9 to 5 that
Mm,
I was going to every day. I was doing most of my work from home. So
mm,
I was able to turn the book into my 9 to 5, which
oh,
was a
okay.
rare, rare gift that I had.
Good.
I
Mm,
mean, a blessing and a curse at that
yeah.
time. And so, like, I signed the contract to write the book. I signed it in November 2019.
Mm,
And basically, for the first half of 2020, it was strictly research,
mm,
nothing else, just interviews,
mm,
uh, looking up documents, primary documents, and things like that.
mm,
And by about the summer of 2020, I started, it's so funny that the writing almost becomes the easier part of the book.
mm.
I started writing, really putting words on a page while still doing research
Okay.
by the summer of 2020. And by March of 2021, the main draft of the manuscript was done. There was still work to be done. We still
Mm,
had another year before we went
mm,
to press when we were acquiring photography and
yeah.
approving layouts and things like
Mm,
that. But the
mm.
lion's share of the work had been done by then. In fact, in through late 2021, while I was prepping that book, I was already starting to research my next book.
Oh, nah,
Kind of
busy.
running into each other. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's good. Um, so looking and thinking about this book, how do you define this book? Is it just a biography, or do you define it in a different way?
It's definitely more than a biography.
Mm,
It's also a history
mm,
because the Sheik's life, his name was Eddie Farhat, but the Sheik's life was so shrouded in mystery. He
mm,
wanted it that way. He had a very uh top secret protected character in
yeah.
wrestling and really lived that character. So
Mm,
because I couldn't give every last detail like I would have wanted to do about his life, I tried to make the book bigger than just one man's life. And it's
mm,
also how he sits in the context of what was happening in the wrestling business all through
mm,
those years and also in just American culture at large,
okay.
really North American culture, US and Canada, and
Mm,
how he fit into that.
mm,
So it became a much bigger topic. So it's not as laser focused
mm,
as your conventional biography might be. It's kind of a book that will help you learn about what the whole ecosystem that he existed
okay.
in through those years. Yeah.
Okay. So thinking more about this book, what are some pieces, I mean, one or two, or even characters that are really your favorite?
Aside from the Sheik himself.
Yes, aside from the Sheik, what else really just kind of grabs a hold of you that this is a great piece?
Well, you mean it as far as a character?
It could be a character, or it could be a different piece, maybe a setting.
Well,
Uh,
there's a couple things. As far as characters in the book, I know another fascinating one was a wrestler named Bobo Brazil, whose real name
Mhm.
is Houston Harris, who was it was very interesting because he was his arch rival in the ring. I mean,
Mm.
they were like Batman and the Joker and
Yeah.
Sherlock Holmes and Moriarty, and
Mm.
yet they were the best of friends in real life.
Mhm.
And in fact, at one point, when unfortunately Brazil was going through a divorce, he actually was staying at the Sheik's home. The Sheik had this huge estate in Williamston.
Mm.
And wrestling fans would have lost their minds if they knew
Yeah.
that, 'cause these guys were supposed
Yes.
to hit each other.
Yeah.
So that was a very interesting dynamic to
Yeah.
explore. Their feud and their matches went on. I mean, they probably
Mm.
wrestled for a longer stretch of time than any other kind of hero and villain in
Mm.
wrestling history ever. You're talking about
Yeah.
some 30, 35 years that it stretched on for. But as far as like pieces in the book, there's something that I started the book with, which
Mm.
blew me away, and I had to make it the beginning of the book. And it was something I uncovered through newspaper research,
Mm.
which was learning that Eddie Farhat, the Sheik, as a young boy, as a 12-year-old boy, 13 years old, had run away from home and
Mhm.
had hitchhiked with some of his friends to try to get to California, apparently. And
Yeah.
they got picked up about 45 minutes from home. But there's even a quote from the kid in the newspaper. This is like 1939 or
Mm.
something, 38, saying, we were trying to get to California where it's sunny all the time and where there's lots of money.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, this is a kid who is going to become one of the most famous wrestlers of all time.
Mm.
And and you can see it already in this early stage that he's got this larger than life personality as a
Yeah.
child.
Mm.
And I said, this is the beginning of my book. This is
Yeah.
how I don't think anybody on earth is aware living today
Mm.
that this happened,
Yeah.
except for me, who's
Yeah.
doing research. So that had to be the beginning of the book, and it is.
Yes. That's an excellent piece. And it really is, I think, my favorite, just to think about it, a kid that young, trying to go westward, make it rich and that larger than life personality. So that really got me interested and roped into this book. Um, so changing gears a little bit, what did it mean to you to be selected, or to have this book, I should say, be selected as a Michigan Notable Book?
I was absolutely thrilled
Mm.
because I didn't know if the book would really be able to find an audience. I was doing my
Mm.
best because, like I said, I was making it personality driven.
Yeah.
And I was trying, but I remember thinking, okay, this is a guy who died 20 years ago.
Hmm.
This guy who peaked 50 years ago as far as
Yeah.
being a main attraction and a star.
Mm.
Are there going to be people and who care?
Mm.
And what I discovered, especially in the Michigan area, is the
Hmm.
answer is a very big yes.
Yeah.
I was able to reach out to
Mm.
people like Dave Brzezinski, who and the late Mark Bujan, who dedicated their
Mm.
lives to researching and even being a part of Detroit wrestling history.
Hmm.
Dave, in fact, was the last manager of the Sheik in
Hmm.
wrestling. And so these were people, when I started to get to know them and started to get taken in by a lot of them, and I don't mean taken in like
Yeah.
time, but like
Yeah.
taken inside,
Yeah.
I was really learning that this character, this person, is still very much beloved among people of a certain age.
Mm.
And so there was a recognition, and it was confirmed when I came out there, and I would
Mm.
have people coming up to me, saying, "Oh my God, my dad loved the Sheik," or rather, my dad hated the Sheik. And
Yeah.
we used to go to Cobo Arena, and I
Mm.
remember watching it on TV. And you
Mm.
see that a lot more than, let's say, I live in the Northeast,
Yeah.
where back in the days of regional wrestling, we had Bruno Sammartino here.
Yeah.
So the name of the Sheik is maybe not as well remembered here. So it
Mm.
was very encouraging to see that, and even to see, because my dream was too that the book's appeal would go beyond wrestling fans. It would go
Mm.
into the territory of people who just want to read a good biography, or who are interested in sports books, or
Mm.
who are interested in entertainment history. And I started to see that. And for me, the recognition from the Library of Michigan was a confirmation of that. So it was extremely gratifying.
Oh, excellent. Good, good. I'm glad. And you sort of already answered this particular question, but maybe you can, elaborate a little bit more. Um, so for those readers out there who are not interested in wrestling and that whole ecosystem, why should they pick up this book and read it? And you mentioned a little bit already of, why, but could you explain a little bit more?
I think there's so many areas that this book kind of intersects into.
Mm.
So if you're interested in the cultural history of America in the 20th century.
Mhm.
This book is valuable. It talks a lot about that. It talks, it gets into issues of identity and race
Mhm.
you know, the state of middle America at the time. It talks about what was happening in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, not just in Detroit and the greater Michigan area, but all over the country. And I think for people that are interested in the history of show business, you have to
Oh,
remember pro wrestling is show business, especially
mhm.
when you're talking about a character like the Sheik. It absolutely is showbiz. I mean, this is a man who created a persona and lived it in
Mhm.
the way that people like Mae West have done, or
Mhm.
Groucho Marx, or in more recent years, somebody like a Mr. T or Andy Kaufman,
Mhm.
Liberace, where
Mhm.
they create this persona that becomes almost who they are to the public, where it's not just a character anymore.
Yeah.
So if those kind of stories interest you, this is a great book. It's beyond just, oh, I want to learn about the history of wrestling in Detroit.
Mhm.
And that's there.
Yeah.
But it's a much bigger book than that, because I wanted it to be a bigger book than that.
And it really is. It's a fascinating story. So one of our last questions is, which writers or works have you found yourself reading recently that really
No,
interesting to you?
there have been a couple of books that
Mm.
I'm a slow reader, so I'm one of those people that
Mm.
likes to read multiple books at the same
Yeah.
time, because I don't want
Mm.
to wait, so I can do that. I can juggle them in my head.
Yeah.
So recently, this was recommended to me. There's a great, speaking of entertainment, like a true crime book called
Mm.
Tinseltown. And it's by I forget the name of the author, William Mann. That's the guy, and I think
Yeah.
it won the Edgar Award for best true
Okay.
crime book a couple of years ago. And
Mm.
it's all about this very famous murder mystery of a Hollywood director in the silent era named
Mm.
William Desmond Taylor. And it's a story that's almost kind of forgotten today, but at the time it gripped the
Mhm.
attention of the nation. So that's been fascinating me. There's another book called Fall Guys, The Barnum's
Okay.
About, which is actually a 1930s book
Mm.
on the wrestling business at that time. It's
Oh,
a very unique book because it breaks through the secrecy of the business at a time 90 years ago when it was just as much show business as it is today. And it's
okay.
fascinating to learn that. And the book, the version I have, is an annotated version
Mhm.
by these two historians, Steve Yohe and oh, I forget the other guy's name, but two historians who
Mhm.
kind of break down the truth and the falsehood
Mhm.
of what's in the book, which I love to see that done in wrestling as a wrestling historian myself. So that's what I've been reading, those two books simultaneously.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds good. And for the final question, did you want to talk a little bit more about what you're working on right now? This book that you just briefly mentioned at the beginning?
I'd love to. Yes.
Yes.
So the book that I actually started while I was finishing up Chic
Mm.
is not my latest book. That book's done and out. That
Oh.
book's called Superheroes: The History of a Pop Culture Phenomenon from Ant-Man to Zorro.
Mm.
And it is exactly that. It's the history of the superhero genre. There's
Mm.
partly the history of comic books, but mainly of superhero fiction. And that book is actually out now.
Okay.
But the one that I'm immersed in now is another
Mm.
wrestling biography, and it's somebody who is near and dear to my heart as a Northeast wrestling fan. It's Gorilla Monsoon,
Mm.
who was a phenomenon in
Mm.
the Worldwide Wrestling Federation in the 60s and 70s, and then later became in the national WWF
Mm.
of 80s and 90s. He became the voice and face of the company. I mean, second
Mm.
only to Vince McMahon himself as an announcer,
Mm.
beloved by fans my age for that reason, and also by the older fans who remembered him as a wrestler. And so that was another person where I thought, how is it possible that no one's done this book yet, especially WWE themselves, and
Yeah.
not wanting to jinx it or anything, because he
Yeah.
was somebody, like an Andre the Giant, who was beloved in that company.
Mm.
And so that became my next idea. It was suggested to me, even on a podcast that I was on when I was being interviewed for the Chic book by
Mm.
a photographer named Dr. Mike Lano, who
Mm.
and a light bulb went off in my head, and I said, "My God, yes, Gorilla Monsoon, that's
Yeah.
the one." And I've been, so now where I'm at is that research phase I was talking
Mm.
about, where
Mm.
I'm actually in my least favorite part of the process, which
Yeah.
is transcribing the
Mm.
interviews. It's where you get to
Yes.
the point where you almost don't want to do any more interviews, because all you're thinking about is the work that's going to be involved in transcribing.
Grabbing.
And you can't do that because you have to do more interviews, you know.
Yeah.
And so I have AI that I use, that an AI program that helps me to transcribe, but the
Yeah.
AI doesn't know about wrestling. So I usually have to go in there and revise the whole damn thing. So
Yeah.
it's very time consuming, but I'm looking forward to really starting that writing maybe by the end of the summer. I'm in
Mhm.
that process of coalescence, like I was
Yeah.
talking about, where the theme and the arc is taking shape in my head. So it's supposed to be the manuscript is due next May.
Okay.
Hopefully, I
Mhm.
hit that deadline.
Okay.
And judging by that, and I don't have a publication date yet, but I would say it's probably going to be late 2024 or maybe early 2025 that the book would be out.
Okay. That sounds good. I'm certain that, all the listeners will be very interested. Those who are very interested in sports and particularly wrestling will probably find that also valuable and fascinating. So I want to thank you, Brian, for taking the time this morning to speak with me, and to the audience who are going to be listening in later on. And I just want to remind everyone that this will be available on our website along with the other Michigan author conversations. So once again, thank you to everyone. Thank you, Brian, and have a wonderful day.